Many people think that architects spend their days furiously creating something from nothing while sketching on blank sheets of paper. They're usually surrounded by a number of glasses of red wine and probably wearing an outfit of black that makes them look like they stepped out of a funeral home. That stereotype is somewhat true, but it's not entirely true, and it obscures the actual relationships that creative designers have with the things they create. Also, people tend to think that creative ideas are born in a flash of genius, almost a bright light that's fallen out of the sky, that hits us in a wave of emotion and intuition. And while that can happen, the truth is that our process is much more nuanced, much more programmatic, much more careful in how we understand the things that we have to make. I often start with inquiry. Inquiry is very important, so I like to ask myself questions and I like to ask other people questions. In fact, you could say that the questions are more important than the answers, because if you don't ask the right question, you probably won't get the right answer. Some questions are quite unique because they lead to other questions. There is no real clear answer. These are the kind of questions that children like to ask. They just constantly build on themselves. Some questions require a great deal of interpretation to understand what they mean or what they might lead to. Some questions are hooks for unsuspecting answers, very unusual circumstances surrounding these questions. Some questions are so personal that maybe the questioner is the only person who knows the actual answer. Some questions work better in other languages for some reason. Some questions are just plain cool, and that's all they are. Other questions help us gain perspective, help us see things in a new way. And these are very important in a process of design and creativity before the comet comes and hits you. Now, we were recently given the commission to design the Theodore Roosevelt Presidential Library out in western North Dakota here in a town called Medora. You may know of the project. Well, the first thing we said to ourselves is, what is a presidential library anyway? And how can it serve a president who's no longer living? And why is it here? All of these questions flooded our minds. And we began to say, what process could lead us to a right solution that would be appropriate for this question? The answer might surprise you. And that's because the process that we go through is filled with inquiry. The answer is grass. Maybe this presidential library is going to be about grass. Why not? It's an important part of the future and of the history of this region. And it can be something that lives far into the future beyond those of us that may visit the library when it first opens. And grass is an important part of the area where you live. We all think we sort of understand presidential libraries. You might have seen a few or been to a few. They tend to be rather stoic, Greco-Roman affairs with very formal entries. The landscape outside of them is rather artificial, sort of artificial grass and things like that, and lots of parking, so there's a lot of asphalt. Is that really the right kind of presidential library for this place in North Dakota? You have to ask yourself, what is the right direction that may lead beyond this? Also, you have to ask yourself, why is it being built in North Dakota? Theodore Roosevelt was from New York. His family was there. He was raised there. But most of you are probably aware that he did visit North Dakota many times, and the history of those visits is very intriguing. So if you may know this, that in his younger life, he was very infirm, Theodore Roosevelt, and two people helped take care of him as he grew into a young man and into a man. Those were his first wife and his mother. He grew very close to them and was really sort of really well connected to their lives and them to his. And one day, on the same day, within 2 hours of each other, they both died of two separate diseases. And that day was Valentine's Day. How tragic can that possibly be? He became despondent. It was difficult for him to understand where his life might go. He hadn't built his understanding of his life. But some of his friends approached him and said, well, you know, you were out in North Dakota a year or so ago, and maybe you should return and find yourself there in the vastness of the landscape and the rigor of this wilderness that existed at the time. So he packed up and he went there and he built the Teddy Roosevelt that we know, and he did that here in North Dakota. So there's a good reason that the library is here, for you to understand that connection that he had. And our job was to make sure you or anyone visiting would feel that same connection. When Theodore Roosevelt was in North Dakota, he did walk through the landscape, move through it, ride through the landscape, as you might imagine, but he also read a lot of books. He was a voracious reader, reading hundreds of books a year. It's astonishing. I could barely make it through a small portion of the number of books that he read. He was reading both the landscape as he moved through it, and he was reading literature. So in a way, he was bringing these two worlds together, the narrative of landscape and the narrative of literature in real time. We like to say that a story draws on the relationships in the landscape of place and projects those relationships onto the landscape of our minds. And that's an important consideration when you realize how connected Theodore Roosevelt was to these places and to the activities of his mind. So we began to develop a theory that this could be a living library, not a library that's a museum about the past only, a library that would move forward into the future as new generations experienced it, and it would be placed within a thoughtful, authentic landscape, not a sea of parking or a bunch of grass with some flowers that don't belong. So in that sense, we began to really question how we could do that. How can you make this happen? Well, one thing that's important is to have a visceral connection to the world. So I went out myself walking across the Badlands. I'm an avid hiker, so I would not recommend you do this, but I walked 10 days alone through the Badlands. There's my little tent in the middle. I carried in everything and carried out everything, and I got to feel the solitude of this place the way people might have had that same experience in the past. I got to see the colors of the morning sky and the evening sky. Then we returned to the place where they wanted to build this library, and we tried to understand what it meant in this context. And we sketched and we talked and we evaluated things, and we found many non-native plants there on the top of the bluff. This little salsify flower is not native to the region here. So those were one of the questions we had. How do we make this the right kind of place when it's already something else? We then went back to moving through the landscape, and we just looked at things and picked up things. We pick up rocks and look at them and talk about them. Very intuitive in some ways. Some of these rocks made it back to our campfire and to our studio, and we made these funny little models you can see out of some of the rocks. They didn't really mean anything. They were just a way of having some fun to open up our minds. But some of the rocks we picked up seemed to grow in their impressions upon us. Walking along the Little Missouri River, we picked up 2 soft pebbles, which is rare in the Badlands, rounded. And then we saw a leaf that had just fallen from a tree nearby, beautiful green color. We didn't know what they meant, we just took them. And as we were looking at them, we looked at the program, the functional needs of the library that were described to us by the organizers. And there needed to be a community center as well as a museum. One was for the day-to-day life of the people that live nearby, and the other was for the many visitors that come from around the world. The 2 pebbles became those 2 pieces of the function of the building, and the leaf was laid across those 2 pebbles to hold it into a society of design. So the building is essentially 2 pebbles and a leaf that we found somewhere along the edge of the Little Missouri. When we made that shape, we did recognize also that the silhouette of it fit well into the silhouette that we saw in the Badlands themselves, these beautiful buttes and mesas and bluffs everywhere. And this would be a softer version or a smaller version of one of those in the distance, so that it would feel it belonged in that landscape. Once again, we returned to the site, so we did a lot of walking around. When we came to the site, we saw this. It's the first view you have of where the library was supposed to be. We were told that most people expected the library to be placed right in the middle of this picture, at the crest of the butte, right there where everybody could see it. And we thought, well, if we do that, we're going to lose all this prairie. We're going to lose all this natural phenomenon. Look how beautiful that view is. You don't need to do anything to it at all. So we evaluated the plans, and we thought, let's move the site just to one side to preserve and protect this prairie grass. And the building, the library, would frame the landscape from the edge of a bluff. It was a little counterintuitive, but it did create this rather interesting idea that as you arrive, you see the prairies, and then you shift your eye and you see the library, and you move along a boardwalk to approach it. If you approach from the wash just below the bluff, the library would just peek out just barely over the bluff. And that's interesting because you wouldn't see it right away. You would see it only after you look a few times. And that can be just as dramatic as seeing something all at once. We return to Theodore Roosevelt's life, and one of the things we recognize that when he was alive and the people that came before him and those at the time that lived in the region moved mostly on foot or by horse, which is much slower than driving around in a car. So we had to figure out how can we bring people to a different speed of life, slow everything down so that they could experience nature in the way you would without having a vehicle to drive. So we built this loop, this boardwalk around the site, and you could move around this boardwalk and experience the landscape in different ways. The boardwalk was completely flat, it's completely flat, but the terrain is not. So the terrain goes up and down, which means that as this boardwalk moves through the terrain, it either rests on the ground when it's flat on it, or it has to go over it where there's a little dip, or it gets carved into it where there's a little hill. So the position of your body is always taking in the position of the landscape, and that will help you see things in a new way. We made a complete life-size, one-to-one model of this boardwalk. So we did it by pressing the grass down, and we could actually walk this boardwalk, and we even printed out where the building would be up there. You can even see it on some satellite digital imagery like Google here on the lower right as to the extent of this proposal. We also asked ourselves, how does this site relate to the prairie at large? Because the prairies of the great North American landscape are vast. They go all the way from the tundra of the north to the deserts of the south. They're one of the greatest ecosystems on the planet that we've lost sight of. We needed to learn how we could influence or be a part of that larger landscape, and this is where grasses started to become interesting. We recognize that the prairie grasses manage carbon in a useful way to help the environment. They provide nutrients to the soil and bring bacteria back to life, so that if we could bring this somehow to its real condition, its authentic condition, it would revitalize the top of this butte. The problem is, what's there now is no longer natural. It's been changed over a few centuries. Just to think a little bit about what this landscape means to us all, the place where we're standing now, not that long ago, only about 10,000 years ago, and for 20 or 30,000 years before that, before people really occupied the North American continent, it was ruled by these megafauna, these massive mammals. They were gigantic. There were horses here before they were reintroduced from Europe sometime later, but the horses were twice the size of the horses we know of today. Massive mammoths and mastodons and saber-toothed tigers were just roaming this place for tens of thousands of years. They built this landscape. And we just came only recently and decided we were going to change it. So we're still grappling with that landscape, that terrain that existed for over 1 million years. The problem is it has created fuel conditions that are unnatural for most people and most climates and most types of use. So when we say there's wildfires, and we're all getting used to more and more wildfires, those are not wildfires. They're actually just uncontrolled fires. A wildfire is something that's wild that's burning, but none of this landscape is wilderness or wild. It doesn't exist in the way that it did when it was actually wild, and that's why these fires kind of get out of control. So we thought, how can we bring this back? We knew we needed to do something like a controlled burn on the top of the bluff to burn off all the junk that was up there that had really deteriorated the soil. So we asked the community, can we please burn the top of the butte? And they said, nope, we don't want that. You're not going to do that. It's dangerous and we don't like the idea. So we went back to our drawing board, and how are we going to do this? Shortly after we got the no vote, a thunderstorm came through Medora. A single bolt of lightning reached down and hit the center of our site and burned the whole thing down. It was fantastic. The fire was extreme, and I think some people thought we were communicating with God, so we started to get our way a little more. It was a useful burn because it didn't damaged too much around the fire, and nobody was hurt. So it really stayed just within the confines of our site. Really miraculous. The things that were burned, we're saving. Most people said, well, remove it. We don't like it. It's burned. But these will become habitat for birds and other creatures in the future. Then we started to talk about seeds because we needed to replant, and nobody really knew the specific nature of what seeded this place for tens of thousands of years. We hooked up with North Dakota State University, ecologists. Yeah, there you are. They're doing a big job here. And some ecologists called Rez and our partners JLG. And we started a seed collection project. We have enlisted an army of people in the community to go out and find the right kinds of seeds so that we can reseed this place and make these seeds available for ranchers, those that own livestock, for other people in the community, and make it real and authentic. And so we've been collecting these seeds for quite some time, and I have a little bottle of some of these little gems of little seeds. These are the gems of the future, man. These little seeds of these prairie grasses. And we started to dry them, clean them, store them. They're being germinated. They're working through the NDSU system and being created in such a way that people can soon use them in their own lives. We also created this calendar, this crazy calendar, which is a circular calendar, December at the top, and each pie shape going around are all the months. And if you draw a line from the center of the calendar out, it crosses everything that's proposed to happen on any given day, in this case, the 21st of February. As you move that line around, you're crossing all the different things that could possibly happen on the site at any given time. So you're able to curate conflicts between nature and human activity by using this circular calendar. So you really don't want to have something happening during grouse mating season. So you kind of move the thing that you thought might happen just a little. You can't move the grouse. They're going to mate when they want to mate. So we're just going to find a way to make it all work and balance. And we also extended the project and the discussions to the tribal nations who gave us a great deal of information. We are going to ensure that the project connects to their nation lands and to their experiences and their economies so that they can benefit also from this project. They taught us a lot, too, about design. That's very special. They taught us interesting things about design. I always think of directions as north, east, south, and west. That's what we all think about, and that's a flat thing. But in many tribal cultures, they do up and down. There are 6 directions, the 4 directions that are astronomical, and an up and a down. We were so impressed by that. We're making this little pavilion where you recline and you look up at the stars, and in the center is a stone, which is so highly polished when you look down into the stone, you'll see the stars of the sky reflected in it. So you'll get up and down at the same time. And lastly, I just want to close with some beautiful ideas where you're able to move up onto the roof and look at the stars in this beautiful place in the country and in the world. In the day, you're able to ride and meet with your friends. We're designing swings, so you can just go there and swing. You don't ever have to go to the library at all. You can just swing with your friends. As you approach the library itself, there's this covered area which you can move through. To the right is the Children's Center and the Community Center. To the left is the museum. Once inside this covered porch, which is under the leaf and between the 2 pebbles, your view is framed to the wash and to the prairies beyond. Once you're inside the lobby, the walls are majestic, almost as tall as this room, and they're made of solid earth. They're not made of concrete, they're not made of brick, they're not made of wood. There's nothing inside them but earth. And the earth that we made them from is earth from the areas surrounding the site. So you can walk up and touch it and feel the earth that this building came from. I just want to close by asking us all, is it necessary to use archaic modes of civilization that are not necessarily relevant to ourselves today or to the places we work within to represent who we are? These are beautiful structures, and I'm a big fan of ancient architecture from Greece and Rome. But can we not create something that has a natural condition that's just as representative of the power of our politics and of the people who we are? In order to do that, we have to say one thing. Should we always start by putting people first and then asking nature to kind of fit in? Or do we start with nature and then invite humans into the picture? If you work that way, we find a more stable way of building the future. And that's important. And we have to also recognize that it's first and foremost important to manage human nature before we try to manage Mother Nature. Thank you.